Mr. Fox's Friendship. Mr. Fox one day had a long talk with Mr. Possum about friendship, and Mr. Fox did most of the talking because he had a plan in mind that he wanted to have Mr. Possum all ready for when it was time to carry it out. Yes, Mr. Fox said, friendship, my dear friend, is the greatest thing in the world, and one who really appreciates a friend shows it most when he goes to that friend for help. It is the making happy of others that counts, not what you do for them. Don't you see, Mr. Possum? Mr. Possum blinked his little eyes and said he guessed he did. Of course you do, said Mr. Fox. I know if I came to you and asked for something, you would give it to me in a minute. That is the sort of friend you are. But the one that appreciates friendship the most is the one that asks the favor, and that you made happy or comfortable. I am sure you understand that, Mr. Possum. Mr. Possum blinked again and said he guessed he did, and then Mr. Fox trotted off home to look over his winter supply of comforts. I need another blanket, he said, and I really should have a new stovetop for my cook stove. And if I have a few more things stored away in my pantry, I think I could get along nicely this winter. Then the next day he trotted over to Mr. Possum, and bold as he could be, asked him to loan him these things. I came right to you, dear friend, said Mr. Fox. I knew you would feel hurt if I went to someone else. Mr. Possum took the blanket from his bed and meekly opened the pantry door. But when it came to taking down his stovepipe, he did not look so meek. That is the only stovepipe I have, he said. Couldn't you mend yours, Mr. Fox? I really need that pipe to keep me warm. Why, Mr. Possum, I am surprised enough at you, exclaimed Mr. Fox. I thought you were a real friend, and could appreciate such a friendship as mine. But if you feel that way about the pipe, I think I'd better go right over to Mr. Coon. I am sure he would appreciate having me make a friend of him. So Mr. Possum let him take the pipe. In fact, Mr. Fox kept right on taking it down while talking, and pretty soon he had all the things he wanted, including a basket of supplies. By and by the weather began to get cold, and Mr. Possum lighted a fire in his stove, but as there was no pipe, the smoke came out in the room. Poor Mr. Possum was driven outdoors and sat on the steps with the tears streaming down his face, when along came Jack Rabbit. What are you crying about, Mr. Possum? He inquired. So Mr. Possum told how Mr. Fox had borrowed his stovepipe, and the smoke came out in his eyes and made them smart. Why did you let him have your pipe? Asked Jack Rabbit. Oh, he is such a good friend of mine, he would not think of going to anyone else, said Mr. Possum. And then he told Jack about all the things he had loaned to Mr. Fox. If he is such a good friend of yours, said Jack, he will not mind if you ask for them. He has had them quite a while, it strikes me. But he will keep them all winter and let you freeze if you do not take them away from him. That is the sort of friend I think he is. You had better go after those things before you freeze. We are going to have a hard winter, Mr. Possum. Mr. Possum sat on the steps shivering and unhappy after Jack Rabbit left him, and pretty soon he began to think he would take Jack's advice. That, of course, Mr. Fox would be very glad to have come to him for help, because he said that making others comfortable and happy was the real pleasure in being a friend. So, swinging his paws to keep warm, he ran along the wood path to Mr. Fox's house, and found him sitting by his stove, all warm and comfortable. I just came over to borrow those things I loaned you, said Mr. Possum, beginning to perk up a little, for he did not feel as friendly toward Mr. Fox when he thought of his smoke-filled kitchen. "I am sorry, old fellow," said Mr. Fox, "but you can see for yourself that if I let you have the stovepipe, I should be without a fire. And as for the blanket, I really cannot let you have that either. It is the only one I have that is thick and warm." He did not have a thing to say about friendship, Mr. Possum noticed, and as he trotted back home, Mr. Possum began to think that this was the time for friendship to end and justice to begin. That night, while Mr. Fox was sound asleep with Mr. Possum's warm blanket tucked around him, Mr. Possum carefully crawled up to the roof of Mr. Fox's house and pulled the stovepipe out. When he had placed it behind a tree down the wood path, he came back and softly pushed up the window of Mr. Fox's bedroom and carefully slipped over the sill. Mr. Fox was making such a noise that he could not hear any small noises, and was so sound asleep that he could not feel anything either. At least not the soft pulls of Mr. Possum as he took the blanket from the bed. This he put beside the stovepipe. Then he went back to Mr. Fox's pantry window, which he opened softly and crawled inside. He took the preserves and things that were left of what Mr. Fox had carried off and put them in a basket. Mr. Possum closed the window behind him and, running along to the place which he had left the other things, he picked them up and ran for home. The next morning the smoke was coming out of the chimney of Mr. Possum's house, just as it should. When Mr. Fox awoke, he felt cold and reached for the warm blanket that covered him when he went to sleep. It was gone! Mr. Fox sat up and rubbed his eyes and looked around the room. It was just as it was when he went to bed, but the blanket was not there. He did not know quite what to make of this, but he was cold, so the first thing was to jump up and make a fire. This Mr. Fox did, and in a few minutes he had a room filled with smoke, just as poor Mr. Possum's had been the day before. Mr. Fox had to run outside to keep from choking, and through his tears he looked at the roof, only to discover that the pipe was not sticking up through the roof of his house, as it had been when he had went to bed. Holding his coat over his head, he ran through the smoke-filled kitchen to the pantry. The preserves and other goodies were gone too. "He must have come while I was asleep and taken them," said Mr. Fox. "There is no such thing as real friendship. I shall be forced to believe." But he could not believe that poor, meek little Mr. Possum really did this, so he ran through the woods to his house, and, sure enough, there was smoke coming out of the pipe, and when he knocked at the door, Mr. Possum, wrapped in his blanket, opened the door. But before he could speak, Mr. Possum banged the door and, in his face, said, "You try your friendship on Mr. Wolf, over the other side of the mountain. I am sure he will be more appreciative than I, and you would be very silly to waste any more on me, because there isn't going to be any friendship between us, Mr. Fox, ever again." "A cold, cruel world we live in," sighed Mr. Fox, as he ran back to repair the old stovepipe he had thrown out in his yard. "Fine, sensitive natures such as mine feel the hard knocks that they get from such coarse-natured creatures as Mr. Possum. He can't appreciate friendship such as I gave to him.